Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
So it's great to meet you. My name is Rylin Rodgers. For people who like a visual description, I'm a middle-aged white woman with brown and increasingly gray hair, wearing oversized glasses. And I get to work on disability policy, which is the world's greatest job. And people often ask sort of how and why I got in that space. And I joke, but it's not really a joke that I was born into it. I was born in 1975, which means I'm both super old. And I was born the same year that the United States passed federal legislation to give the right for students with disabilities to receive a free and appropriate public education. And so when I showed up at kindergarten 5 years later, I was amongst the first generation of students to be served under an IEP. I'm dyslexic, and I had the very rare privilege, even now, all these years later, to be identified as having a significant learning disability in kindergarten. And so I had an IEP all the way through school, my education, and really am amongst the generation that benefited from policy, making my life significantly different. That trend continued over time, and I've had a variety of experiences, as we all do. I raised two now young adults who have complex physical and medical disabilities, so I understood sort of our healthcare policy system. And it was that experience that really made me make my professional life around policy and making sure that the voice of lived experience is pushing forward good public policy and making sure that people with disabilities are connected to and understand what's happening in the policy space. So I've been lucky to get to do that work. Right now, I'm doing that work for a big corporation, Microsoft, the tech company you might have heard of. And I'm in a role that is new to Microsoft. They created a role about a year and a half ago because they wanted to really focus on addressing the disability divide. And they knew that to do that, they would need to also impact public policy. So it's been fun to make the shift from not for profits and working in the disability community to working in a corporation, but really the same goals, the same focus.
Yeah, because that's my next question. What sorts of things do you work on as a policy advisor? What's the day-to-day like?
Yeah. So in my career, I always say that disability policy is everything. There is no part of public policy, whether it's at local government, at state, at federal level, or international policy, that doesn't impact disability because people with disabilities are part of every community and every place. So that's big and sometimes a little bit too big to really focus on. So in my current job, it's been nice that we focus on policy in a couple of areas. Technology, kind of obvious, Microsoft's tech company. Employment, making sure that the gap between the employment rate for people with disabilities and people without disabilities closes because we're all harmed by the fact that the talents of disabled workers aren't part of our economy at the rate it should be. And then what are some of the ways that we can impact the societal barriers? So still pretty big buckets of topics. The other thing that's true about this work is every day is a little different. Some days it's a lot of research and writing and thinking. Other days it's meetings, a chance to talk to policy leaders and staffers and share and learn from each other. Sometimes it's talking to constituents and communities and understanding lots of perspectives. So every day is a little bit different, which is kind of the fun thing about policy work. And also one of the things that I think is great in policy work because you don't have to be good at all parts of it. You can find the way to engage in it based on what you're good at or interested in.
Yeah, that's cool. So, like, any particular stakeholders that you like partner with in your efforts with like disability policy and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I, as a disabled woman, and also as a reflection of Microsoft's work, you have to work on policy with the people the policy impacts. So the disability community and their voices have to be centered in the policy space. So it's incredibly important to hear from advocacy organizations. There are lots of great groups out there across the disability spectrum that are led by disabled leaders who bring that perspective. Equally important is every individual. Each of us has a very unique experience and perspective, so hearing from a diverse group of stakeholders is incredibly important. I also think it's incredibly important to hear from business leaders, that how important it is across different industries, how much our talent, who are people with disabilities, matter, how much we need to meet the needs of customers with disabilities. So it's a group of sort of perspectives that I think are important, and more, it's been exciting to see the collaboration across different groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like what kind of impact does disability policy have on like the disability community? If you could just speak on that a little.
Yeah, I'm biased because I love policy, but I think policy touches every part of our lives. When we think about recent history and the efforts to protect healthcare in America and protect the right to access healthcare for people who have pre-existing conditions, which most of us as disabled people have something that would count as a pre-existing condition. So the work that happened around policy to a bunch of years ago pass the Affordable Care Act to remove discrimination from healthcare systems, and then to make sure that it didn't go away under the following administration was incredibly important. What's been happening in the recent years, as we have seen the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on disabled communities, higher rates of death, higher rates of sort of lack of access to some services at different parts of the pandemic. That's about policy change. How do we get better data, better voices, better engagement? I mentioned my experience with education. We're still seeing barriers to everyone having the same access to education. We're seeing progress, and it's through policy change and demonstration projects that are funded by Congress in post-secondary education for people with intellectual disabilities, as an example. So I think there's always more to do, but when we sort of dig into why it matters, it's that it touches each of our lives in a real way. If something's broken in a system, there's a policy change that could fix it. And whether that happens quickly or slowly is sometimes a challenge and sometimes a painful challenge, but being engaged and being part of those policy changes is important.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, how can disability policy be a catalyst for change?
Yeah, I think it's the way to change the world. I think that if we get to a place where we have full representation of disabled voices at policy decision making, we're going to have greater equity. We're going to have greater equity and access. We're going to move to a place where systems and infrastructure is designed and accessible from the start, that you don't have to go back later and make something accessible. It's really a catalyst to making something different. I hope in the very short term, we see some big policy changes. I hope we see an end to 14C, which is the ability in the United States to pay people with disabilities less than the minimum wage. That's a policy that we could end, and we could end it this year. And that would support the civil and human rights of disabled workers around our country. So there's lots of change that can happen, and I think it's important that we're all pushing forward on it.
Mm-hmm. Those are some important points there.